Chapter 8. The Psychological Evidence. Was Jesus crazy when he claimed to be the Son of God? When a psychologist or psychiatrist testifies, he shall wear a cone-shaped hat that is not less than 2 feet tall. The surface of the hat shall be imprinted with stars and lightning bolts. Additionally, he shall be required to don a white beard that is not less than 18 inches in length, and shall punctuate crucial elements of his testimony by stabbing the air with a wand. Whenever a psychologist or psychiatrist provides testimony, the bailiff shall contemporaneously dim the courtroom lights and administer 2 strikes to a Chinese gong. By suggesting this amendment to the state statutes in 1997, New Mexico State Senator Duncan Scott left no doubt about his attitude toward experts who testify that defendants are insane and therefore not legally responsible for their crimes. Apparently, Scott's cynicism was shared by a majority of his colleagues. They voted to approve this tongue-in-cheek proposal. The joke got as far as the House of Representatives, which eventually blocked it from becoming law. Admittedly, there's an undercurrent of skepticism in courthouses over psychiatrists and psychologists who testify concerning the mental state of defendants, their ability to cooperate with their attorney in preparing their defense, and whether they were legally insane at the time they committed their crime. Even so, most lawyers recognize that mental health professionals offer important insights for the criminal justice system. I recall a case in which a mild-mannered housewife stood accused of murdering her husband. At first glance, she appeared no different than anybody's mother, well-dressed, pleasant, kindly, looking as if she had just emerged from baking a fresh batch of chocolate chip cookies for the neighborhood children. I scoffed when a psychologist testified she was mentally unable to stand trial. Then her lawyer put her on the witness stand. Initially, her testimony was clear, rational, and lucid. However, it slowly became more and more bizarre as she described, calmly and with great seriousness, how she had been assaulted by a succession of famous individuals, including Dwight Eisenhower and the ghost of Napoleon. By the time she finished, nobody in the courtroom doubted that she was totally out of touch with reality. The judge committed her to a mental institution until she was well enough to face the charges against her. Looks can be deceiving. It's the psychologist's job to peer beneath the defendant's veneer and draw conclusions concerning his or her mental condition. It's an inexact science, which means mistakes and even abuses can occur. But overall, psychological testimony provides important safeguards for defendants. How does all of this relate to Jesus? In the preceding chapter, Dr. Ben Witherington III offered convincing evidence that even the earliest material about Jesus showed he was claiming to be God incarnate. That naturally raises the issue of whether Jesus was crazy when he made those assertions. In search of an expert's assessment of Jesus' mental state, I drove to a suburban Chicago office building to elicit testimony from one of the country's leading authorities on psychological issues. The 7th interview, Gary R. Collins, Ph.D. With a master's degree in psychology from the University of Toronto and a doctorate in clinical psychology from Purdue University, Collins has been studying, teaching, and writing about human behavior for almost half a century. He was a professor of psychology at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School for 2 decades, most of that time as chairman of its psychology division. A live wire with boundless energy and enthusiasm, Collins is a prolific author. He has written nearly 150 articles for journals and other periodicals. He was editor of Christian Counseling Today and contributing editor of the Journal of Psychology and Theology. He also has produced an astounding 45 books on psychology-related topics, including The Magnificent Mind, Family Shock, Can You Trust Psychology, and the classic textbook Christian Counseling, A Comprehensive Guide. In addition, he was general editor of the 30-volume Resources for Christian Counseling, a series of books for mental health professionals. I found Collins in his bright and airy office at the American Association of Christian Counselors, a 15,000-member society of which he was the president. With salt and pepper hair and silver-rimmed glasses, he was looking dapper in a maroon turtleneck sweater, herringbone sports jacket, and gray slacks. Sorry, no pointy hat or flowing white beard. I started our interview by gesturing out the window, where snow was gently falling on evergreen trees. "A few miles in that direction is a state mental institution," I said. "If we were to go over there, I'm sure we'd find some people who claim that they're God. We'd say they were insane. Jesus said he was God. Was he crazy too?" "If you want the short answer," Collins said with a chuckle, "it's no." But I insisted, this is a legitimate topic that's worthy of further analysis. Experts say that people suffering from delusional psychosis may appear rational much of the time, yet can have grandiose beliefs that they are superlative individuals. Some can even attract followers who believe they're geniuses. Maybe that's what happened with Jesus, I suggested. "Well, it's true that people with psychological difficulties will often claim to be somebody they're not," Collins replied as he clasped his hands behind his head. "They'll sometimes claim to be Jesus himself, or President of the United States, or someone else famous, like Lee Strobel," he quipped. "However," he continued, "psychologists don't just look at what a person says. They'll go much deeper than that. They'll look at a person's emotions, because disturbed individuals frequently show inappropriate depression, or they may be vehemently angry, or perhaps they're plagued with anxiety. But look at Jesus. He never demonstrated inappropriate emotions. For instance, he cried at the death of his friend Lazarus. That's natural for an emotionally healthy individual." "He certainly got angry at times," I asserted. "Yes, he did, but it was a healthy kind of anger at people taking advantage of the downtrodden by lining their pockets at the temple. He wasn't just irrationally ticked off because someone was annoying him. This was a righteous reaction against injustice and the blatant mistreatment of people. Other deluded people will have misperceptions," he added. "They think people are watching them or are trying to get them when they're not. They're out of contact with reality. They misperceive the actions of other people and accuse them of doing things that they have no intention of ever doing. Again, we don't see this in Jesus. He was obviously in contact with reality. He wasn't paranoid, although he rightfully understood that there were some very real dangers around him. Or people with psychological difficulties may have thinking disorders. They can't carry on logical conversations. They'll jump to faulty conclusions. They're irrational. We don't see this in Jesus. He spoke clearly, powerfully, and eloquently. He was brilliant and had absolutely amazing insights into human nature. Another sign of mental disturbances is unsuitable behavior, such as dressing oddly or being unable to relate socially to others. Jesus' behavior was quite in line with what would be expected, and he had deep and abiding relationships with a wide variety of people from different walks of life. He paused, though I sensed he wasn't finished yet. I prompted him to continue by asking, "What else do you observe about him?" Collins gazed out the window at the beautiful and peaceful snow-blanketed landscape. When he resumed, it was as if he were reminiscing about an old friend. He was loving, but he didn't let his compassion immobilize him. He didn't have a bloated ego, even though he was often surrounded by adoring crowds. He maintained balance despite an often demanding lifestyle. He always knew what he was doing and where he was going. He cared deeply about people, including women and children, who weren't seen as being important back then. He was able to accept people while not merely winking at their sin. He responded to individuals based on where they were at and what they uniquely needed. "So, doctor, your diagnosis?" I asked him. "All in all, I just don't see signs that Jesus was suffering from any known mental illness," he concluded, adding with a smile, "He was much healthier than anyone else I know, including me." Granted, as we look back through history, we don't see obvious signs of delusion in Jesus. But what about people who were directly interacting with him? What did they see from their much closer vantage point? Some people who were on the scene in the first century would vehemently disagree with you, I pointed out to Collins. They did conclude that Jesus was crazy. John 10, verse 20, tells us that many Jews thought he was demon-possessed and raving mad. Those are strong words. Yes, but that's hardly a diagnosis by a trained mental health professional, Collins countered. Look at what prompted those words. Jesus' moving and profound teaching about being the Good Shepherd. They were reacting because his assertions about himself were so far beyond their understanding of the norm, not because Jesus was truly mentally unbalanced. And notice that their comments were immediately challenged by others, who said in verse 21, "These are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind?" Why is that significant, I asked. Because Jesus wasn't just making outrageous claims about himself. He was backing them up with miraculous acts of compassion, like healing the blind. You see, if I claimed to be President of the United States, that would be crazy. You'd look at me and see none of the trappings of the office of President. I wouldn't look like the President. People wouldn't accept my authority as President. No Secret Service agents would be guarding me. But if the real president claimed to be president, that wouldn't be crazy because he is president, and there would be plenty of confirming evidence of that. In an analogous way, Jesus didn't just claim to be God. He backed it up with amazing feats of healing, with astounding demonstrations of power over nature, with transcendent and unprecedented teaching, with divine insights into people, and ultimately with his own resurrection from the dead, which absolutely no one else has been able to duplicate. So when Jesus claimed to be God, it wasn't crazy. It was the truth. However, Collins' appeal to Jesus' miracles opened the door to other objections. Some people have tried to shoot down these miracles that supposedly help authenticate Jesus' claim to being the Son of God, I said, pulling out a book from my briefcase. I read him the words of skeptic Charles Templeton. Many illnesses, then and now, were psychosomatic and could be cured when the sufferer's perception changed. Just as today a placebo prescribed by a physician in whom the patient has faith can effect an apparent cure, so in an early time, faith in the healer could banish adverse symptoms. With each success, the healer's reputation would grow, and his powers would, as a consequence, become more efficacious. Does this, I demanded, explain away the miracles that supposedly back up Jesus' claim to being the Son of God? Collins' reaction surprised me. I wouldn't have a whole lot of disagreement with what Templeton wrote, Collins replied. You wouldn't? Not really. Might Jesus have sometimes healed by suggestion? I have no problem with that. Sometimes people can have a psychologically induced illness, and if they get a new purpose for living, a new direction, they don't need the illness anymore. The placebo effect? If you think you're going to get better, you often do get better. That's a well-established medical fact. And when people came to Jesus, they believed he could heal them, so he did. But the fact remains, regardless of how he did it, Jesus did heal them. Of course, he quickly added, that doesn't explain all of Jesus' healings. Often, a psychosomatic healing takes time. Jesus' healings were spontaneous. Many times, people who are healed psychologically have their symptoms return a few days later. But we don't have any evidence of this. And Jesus healed conditions like lifelong blindness and leprosy, for which a psychosomatic explanation isn't very likely. On top of that, he brought people back from the dead. And death is not a psychologically induced state. Plus, you have all of his nature miracles, the calming of the sea, turning water into wine. They defy naturalistic answers. Well, maybe. However, Collins' mention of the miracle of turning water into wine brought up another possible explanation of Jesus' amazing feats. Have you ever seen a stage hypnotist give water to someone they've put in a trance and then suggest to them that they were drinking wine? They smack their lips, they get giddy, they start feeling intoxicated, just as if they were swigging a cheap Bordeaux. British author Ian Wilson has raised the question of whether this is how Jesus convinced the wedding guests at Cana that he transformed jugs of water into the finest fermented libation. In fact, Wilson discusses the possibility that Jesus may have been a master hypnotist, which could explain the supposedly supernatural aspects of his life. For instance, hypnosis could account for his exorcisms, his transfiguration, during which 3 of his followers saw his face glow and his garments shine as white as light, and even his healings. As evidence, Wilson cites the modern example of a 16-year-old boy whose serious skin disorder was inexplicably healed through hypnotic suggestion. Perhaps Lazarus wasn't really brought back from the dead. Couldn't he have been in a death-like trance that had been induced by hypnosis? As for the resurrection, Jesus could have effectively conditioned the disciples to hallucinate his appearances in response to certain prearranged cues, the breaking of bread, for a predetermined period after his death, Wilson speculated. This would even explain the enigmatic reference in the Gospels to Jesus' inability to perform many miracles in his hometown of Nazareth. Said Wilson, Jesus failed precisely where, as a hypnotist, we would most expect him to fail, among those who knew him best, those who had seen him grow up as an ordinary child. Largely responsible for any hypnotist's success rate are the awe and mystery with which he surrounds himself, and these essential factors would have been entirely lacking in Jesus' hometown. You have to admit, I said to Collins, that this is a rather interesting way of trying to explain away Jesus' miracles. There was a look of incredulity on his face. This guy has a whole lot more faith in hypnosis than I do, he exclaimed. While it's a clever argument, it just doesn't stand up to analysis. It's full of holes. One by one, Collins began to enumerate them. First, there's the problem of a whole bunch of people being hypnotized. Not everybody is equally susceptible. Stage hypnotists will talk in a certain soothing tone of voice to the audience and watch for people who seem to be responding. And then they'll pick these people as their volunteers because they're readily susceptible to hypnosis. In a big group, many people are resistant. When Jesus multiplied the bread and fish, there were 5,000 witnesses. How could he have hypnotized them all? Second, hypnosis doesn't generally work on people who are skeptics and doubters. So how did Jesus hypnotize his brother James, who doubted him but later saw the resurrected Christ? How did he hypnotize Saul of Tarsus, the opponent of Christianity, who had never even met Jesus until he saw him after his resurrection? How did he hypnotize Thomas, who was so skeptical he wouldn't believe in the resurrection until he put his fingers in the nail holes in Jesus' hands? Third, concerning the resurrection, hypnosis wouldn't explain the empty tomb. I jumped in. I suppose someone could claim that the disciples had been hypnotized to imagine the tomb was empty, I offered. Even if that were possible, Collins replied, Jesus certainly couldn't have hypnotized the Pharisees and Roman authorities, and they would have gladly produced his body if it had remained in the tomb. The fact that they didn't tells us the tomb was really empty. Fourth, look at the miracle of turning water into wine. Jesus never addressed the wedding guests. He didn't even suggest to the servants that the water had been turned into wine. He merely told them to take some water to the master of the banquet. He's the one who tasted it and said it was wine, with no prior prompting. Fifth, the skin healing that Wilson talks about wasn't spontaneous, was it? Actually, I said, the British Medical Journal says it took 5 days after the hypnosis for the reptilian skin, called ichthyosis, to fall off the teenager's left arm, and several more days for the skin to appear normal. The hypnotic success rate for dealing with other parts of his body over a period of several weeks was 50 to 95%. Compare that, Collins said, with Jesus healing 10 lepers in Luke 17. They were instantaneously healed, and 100%. That's not explainable merely by hypnosis, and neither is the healing of a man with a shriveled hand in Mark 3. Even if people were in a trance and merely thought his hand had been healed, eventually they would have found out the truth. Hypnosis doesn't last a real long time. And finally, the Gospels record all sorts of details about what Jesus said and did, but never once do they portray him as saying or doing anything that would suggest he was hypnotizing people. I could go on and on. I laughed. I told you it was an interesting explanation. I didn't say it was convincing, I said. Yet books are being written to advance these kind of ideas. It's just amazing to me, Collins replied, how people will grasp at anything to try to disprove Jesus' miracles. Before we finished our interview, I wanted to tap into Collins' psychological expertise in one more area that skeptics find troubling. Jesus was an exorcist, I observed. He talked to demons and cast them out of people they supposedly possessed. But is it really rational to believe that evil spirits are responsible for some illnesses and bizarre behavior? Collins wasn't disturbed by the question. From my theological beliefs, I accept that demons exist, he replied. We live in a society in which many people believe in angels. They know there are spiritual forces out there, and it's not too hard to conclude that some might be malevolent. Where you see God working, sometimes those forces are more active, and that's what was probably going on in the time of Jesus. I noticed Collins had referred to his theological beliefs and not his clinical experience. Have you, as a psychologist, ever seen clear evidence of the demonic? I asked. I haven't personally, but then I haven't spent my whole career in clinical settings, he said. My friends in clinical work have said that sometimes they have seen this, and these are not people who are inclined to see a demon behind every problem. They tend to be skeptical. The psychiatrist M. Scott Peck wrote a bit about this kind of thing in his book, People of the Lie. I pointed out that Ian Wilson, in suggesting that Jesus may have used hypnosis to cure people who only believed they were possessed, said dismissively that no realistic individual would explain a state of possession as the work of real demons. To some degree, you find what you set out to find, Collins said in response. People who deny the existence of the supernatural will find in some way, no matter how far-fetched, to explain a situation apart from the demonic. They'll keep giving medication, keep drugging the person, but he or she doesn't get better. There are cases that don't respond to normal medical or psychiatric treatment. Could Jesus' exorcisms really have been psychosomatic healings, I asked? Yes, in some cases, but again, you have to look at the whole context. What about the man who was possessed and Jesus sent the demons into pigs and the pigs ran off the cliff? What's going on if that was a psychosomatic situation? I think Jesus really did drive out demons, and I think some people do that today. At the same time, we shouldn't be too quick to jump to a demonic conclusion when faced with a recalcitrant problem. As C.S. Lewis put it, there are two equal and opposite errors we can fall into concerning demons. One is to disbelieve their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are equally pleased with both errors. You know, Gary, that idea might fly in the American Association of Christian Counselors, but would secular psychologists consider it rational to believe in the demonic? I asked. I thought Collins might take some offense at the question, which came out sounding more condescending than I had intended, but he didn't. It's interesting how things are changing, he mused. Our society today is caught up in spirituality. It's a term that can mean almost anything, but it does recognize the supernatural. It's very interesting what psychologists are believing these days. Some are into Eastern mystical stuff. Some talk about the power of shamans to influence people's lives. Whereas 25 years ago, the suggestion of demonic activity would have been immediately dismissed, many psychologists are beginning to recognize that maybe there are more things in heaven and earth than our philosophies can account for. Collins and I had drifted a bit from the original point of our interview. As I thought about our talk while I was driving home, I returned to the central issue that had brought me to him. Jesus claimed to be God. Nobody is suggesting he was intentionally deceptive. And now Collins has concluded, based on 35 years of psychological experience, that he was not mentally impaired. However, that left me with a new question. did Jesus fulfill the attributes of God? After all, it's one thing to claim divinity. It's quite another to embody the characteristics that make God, God. At a stoplight, I pulled a notebook out of my briefcase and scrawled a note to myself. Track down D.A. Carson. I knew that I want to talk to one of the country's leading theologians about the next matter. In the meantime, my talk with Gary Collins prompted me to spend time that night carefully rereading the discourses of Jesus. I could detect no signs of dementia, delusions, or paranoia. On the contrary, I was moved once more by his profound wisdom, his uncanny insights, his poetic eloquence, and his deep compassion. Historian Philip Schaff said it better than I can. Is such an intellect clear as the sky, bracing as the mountain air, sharp and penetrating as a sword, thoroughly healthy and vigorous, always ready and always self-possessed, liable to a radical and most serious delusion concerning his own character and mission? Preposterous imagination.